Second, my remark, it was mentioned about this civilization factor. I don't know if you are familiar, and you should, with the name of Chang Weiwei. Don't mix it with Ai Weiwei, who is a very famous Chinese dissident. Chang Weiwei was personal translator to Deng Xiaoping. Later, he was studying in Geneva in the Academy of Diplomacy. And he is now a kind of media personality, an academic personality in China, very visible. And he published recently 3 volumes in Chinese explaining Wen Ming Guojia, that China is civilizational state, that China is challenging us as a civilization, not as a country. And in this respect, China is putting ahead of this country, 2 so-called centenary or centennial goals. One for 100 years of Chinese Communist Party, which is July the 1st, 2021, that middle class will be created, new model of development will be introduced in China, and the second centenary goals for 100 years of People's Republic of China, which is October the 1st, 2049. Maybe I will be not living anymore at that time, but they are already planning that China will be unified, big China. Of course, peaceful reunification with Taiwan is also included in this strategy. So this is the background and the framework we need to discuss contemporary China, One Belt and Road. And of course, these 2 centenary goals are much more important as domestic issues for the Chinese authorities than any kind of external involvement. Saying so, I will give the floor to Mr. Trucsanyi, who will not using, I'm using, as you see, as an old China hand, only the power of my arguments. He will use the PowerPoint for his presentation. Good luck for him.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for all those who invited me and who helped me to get here. I really appreciate. It's always great to be here in Warsaw, and I really mean it. And before I start, I have a few things I wanted to tell you. One thing, when I'm giving my talk at the university, all my students sit in the first rows because they know that I always ask those who are the farthest from me to answer. So that would put my friend Professor Rhodes first to answer my questions. Of course, I'm not going to do that. Second thing, Professor Góralczyk advised me to use Mind, not necessarily PowerPoint. I'll try to do both. So I hope you'll enjoy that. I will mention a few disclaimers before I start. Maybe some of the things which will sound a bit critical, but I don't think that China and Russia should be put in the same basket. I think that's not often the case in Poland. It's very often the case in the Czech Republic, where I live most of the time. I don't think that Chinese goals towards Poland, Central Europe, or Europe in total are necessarily bad. So I think that for us it is good to develop relations with China, though I think often there are problems, and these come from misunderstanding what China wants. It is sometimes the case that people here think that China is interested in dividing us. I don't think so. So especially in this new Europe, part of the EU, politicians sometimes act in this way, like if China wanted us to be against Brussels. So that's my understanding. That's not the case. And the second thing, I think that sometimes we exaggerate the role China can play in this region, either especially economically, sometimes also politically. Okay, and in my talk, what I'm going to do, I want to basically look at the Belt and Road Initiative. To confuse a little bit, I'm going to use 2 abbreviations, OBOR and BRI, to keep you awake. And I'm going to compare it with the 16+1 platform, which is a little bit older. So I think actually looking at the 16+1, we can learn something about OBOR. And many of the things which previous speakers mentioned will be also mentioned here. I'm really looking forward to comments both from you and from the audience, because I will try to present something of a simplistic theory of Chinese foreign policy with regard to these two initiatives. Okay, so why I say that that we can compare the two? If we look at how these initiatives were born, first of all, 16+1 is a little bit older. As was mentioned, it was formally started here in Warsaw. I'm sorry, over there. There should be Warsaw, 2012.
Too much of Budapest.
Yeah, that's my Hungarian heritage. Although, if you come to Hungary, most Hungarians would say that 16+1 was actually born in Budapest.
Everything is born in Budapest.
Since I'm in between, I would say that it was born in those 2 years. The year after 2013, the 16+1 moved from the initial Chinese offers towards the institutionalization. So in 2013 in Bucharest, for the first time, the final document was accepted by all involved parties, while before it was really a Chinese offer. Later on, in 2015 in Suzhou, it was announced that Belt and Road, that 16+1 is part of Belt and Road Initiative. Looking at the Belt and Road Initiative, it came into existence in 2013 when Chinese president for the first time, we can say, floated the idea in Kazakhstan. It took some time for everyone to notice how big the thing was, both in China and internationally. And a few months ago, in 2017 in Beijing, there was a first major conference. And we can really say that this was the moment of institutionalization of the Belt and Road. What I mean by that, we were told that there will be these summits of Belt and Road. I think it's every 2 years, similarly as there are now summits of 16+1. There should be a secretariat. There are certain financial tools. Really, all these things are similar in these two initiatives. So what are the goals of the two? Let's first look at the 16+1, which is for most of us closer. So when China came here 5-6 years ago and started making promises about new relations and so on, most of the people here really thought that China can be an economic alternative. So that's my main argument, and I think few people dispute that for most of those 16 countries, China is really about the economy. It's about finding a way from being too dependent or over-dependent, as some say, on the Western Europe, both in terms of trade and in terms of investment from the Western Europe. Especially after the financial crisis, when our trade with the developed world decreased and investment also decreased, we were looking for alternatives, and China seemed to offer one. So really, on the side of the CEE, economy is the main issue. Looking at the OBOR, I would say the same thing. For most countries in OBOR, China is really about economic opportunities. Okay, looking at the EU, EU was not very comfortable with the 16+1 from the very beginning. It actually saw it as a Chinese attempt to divide European countries, which would somehow affect the unity of the EU. Eventually, the EU said that as long as the 16+1 deals with pragmatic goals, which it wants to deliver, as long as it deals with economy, it's okay. Now, looking at the Chinese side, it's not so easy to say that China is really only up to economy. As Professor mentioned, the sheer size of Belt and Road, the promises of the money which were on the table were really huge. It's almost clear to most observers that there must be geopolitical consequences. Well, China and most Chinese commentators would say that there are no geopolitical goals of China, that Belt and Road 16+1 are about economy. What I do normally in this situation, I say that there are two groups of scholars. One say that China has economic goals, which it wants to achieve by political means. By this, I mean that, for example, 16+1, China wanted to improve political relations, so it increases trade and investment. There is a second group of scholars which say that China has political goals. Let's leave it open for discussion which they are, and it wants to use economic means to achieve these goals. So by increasing trade, increasing investment, for example here, China wants to have more political leverage, we can say. So what are these goals of 16+1 and OBOR? And actually we can see that they are pretty similar. It's to increase trade, investment, infrastructure plays a very crucial role in both of these initiatives. China often talks about policy coordination in pretty much any area we can think of, from innovation, pretty much any area we can think of. China would like to coordinate policies, and people-to-people contacts are very prominent in both 16+1 and OBOR. So looking at the 16+1 and the results, and some of these was mentioned before, actually I was here in Warsaw in November, and at that time my presentation was mainly about what was achieved in 16+1, and I was arguing for something which I'm going to summarize here without going in detail since I don't have much time for that. So I claim that 16+1 after 5 years came to the situation of hot politics and cold economics. So what I mean by that? When it comes to diplomatic relations, it seems to be consensus, and I'm not disputing it, that the relations between Central and Eastern Europe and China have never been better than they are currently. People-to-people relation, the same thing. We never had so many opportunities to travel between each other, interact. The university cooperation is at its best. Journalists travel both directions. Lots of cultural exchanges. For example, Chinese authors come to the Czech Republic for 1 month, give public talks. Really, there are so many opportunities now for people-to-people relations to improve. So these things have been achieved. Well, when we look at the economy, trade has grown a little bit, but not European exports to China. Chinese exports to CEE increased a little bit, but not too much. So actually the initial goals which were presented, also here in Warsaw and in Budapest, have not been met. When it comes to Chinese investments in the CEE, which many of us hope for, they have largely not happened so far. And those which happened are not greenfield investments, which was really what we would like to see, right? New quality companies hiring high-skilled labor and so on. Extremely little of this kind of FDI took place. I have a few tables, which I'm not going to go to details, which give you evidence from what I'm saying now. I will skip it now, so I can move to the final part of my presentation. Then if any of you would like to see more, I'll be more than happy to discuss that. So this was about the trade. We can see that really we don't see major increases in last 5 years, or even better, actually the years before establishment of 16+1 have brought bigger increases in economic activity than the years after. So especially, for example, for main exporters to China, which is the V4 countries, last 3 years, with the exception of the 2016, have seen decrease in our exports to China. This is, when it comes to investment, very difficult to know the exact number. I will only show you one, and this is from Americs, which uses its own methodology. I believe we can consider it probably the most accurate one. When we look at the CEE countries, unfortunately only EU members are here, and the EU members, we can see only minor increases in Chinese investment. Poland, Czech Republic, Romania had some increases, but actually Western European countries have seen much bigger increases, and they are far above our numbers. So it would be very difficult to say that we can be, for example, bridge for China to Europe if China is numerously times more present in the Western Europe than here. One interesting thing is that unproportionately a lot of Chinese investment in the 16 CEE countries focus on the least developed ones, especially in the Balkans, which are the smallest economically and also when it comes to population. And this kind of builds on what some of the previous speakers said, that China in a way treats 16 CE countries as developing world, and it utilizes similar approaches as it uses in Africa. And that's what I argue, this is why it can successfully do that in Bosnia, Albania, not so much in Poland or Hungary. Okay, there are a few explanations why that is the case. I think some of these are totally misplaced, such as that CE is not an interesting and stable investment environment. We could sometimes hear some people saying this. I don't think that has much true, because China invests huge amounts of money in countries such as Pakistan and Sudan, which are definitely worse investment environment and far less stable than CE countries are. When it comes to other of these explanations, I think they have some true. I'm not going to go through all of this again due to the time limits, but I'll say that I think that the situation of hot politics called economics is one of the evidence that Chinese goals are really primary political. And I will now move to to the discussion of Chinese foreign policy goals and why they are more political. So there was some of the Chinese scholars mentioned, and Professor Wang also discussed a little bit about that. Since Xi Jinping is in power in China, Chinese foreign policy might be moving from economic goals to political goals. Obviously, this is not a consensus; it's not totally accepted. But if that was the case, the CEE might be a good example of this kind of shift. Now, I think also both of the other speakers spoke about the interlinkage between Chinese foreign policy goals, national interest, and domestic politics. And this is really where I put where I think is the key of understanding both 16+1 and OBOR. And I will show you now. I hope you can see it well. Okay. So this is a framework which I built on. Again, it's my simple understanding of Chinese foreign policy. It builds on the three core interests as they were announced by Dai Bingguo, former state chancellor of China. He said that Chinese three core interests are regime security, and then basically economic development, and something which then can transfer to non-material satisfaction of the people. So my interpretation of this is that these three core interests are not at the same level. Regime security should really be seen as the main one, and Chinese Communist Party, which is in power, really depends mostly on the domestic stability. Now, domestic stability in China is mainly achieved thanks to two things. One is material satisfaction of people. If you look at any table of Chinese GDP growth in the last 30 years, you will understand why so many Chinese people are satisfied with how things are presently. Secondly, economy does not need to be enough, so that then there needs to be some kind of non-material satisfaction. And since early 90s, when communism really decreased, or basically is non-existent as a main legitimacy force for the Communist Party, ironically, it's nationalism, which is the main factor for Chinese government to keep people non-materially satisfied with its rule. So what I do over here is that when you look at the material satisfaction or the economic development of China, it really transfers to stable international environment. And stable international environment requires benign action of China. So in this table, I was looking at the South China Sea, which is a topic I did my PhD thesis on. So in South China Sea, for example, China would need to act in a way so it's not perceived as an enemy for the countries. Because if it is perceived as an enemy, it affects the stable international environment. The other countries might join hands against China, and it would affect this open international market, which is so necessary for China. On the other hand, to keep increasingly nationalistic population in China satisfied, Chinese government needs to show that it's very strong in defending Chinese interests. So probably you can understand that in the very same situation, such as in South China Sea, this kind of core interest requires Chinese government to act in a very strong hand. Now, this is a major problem for Chinese government, how to balance between these two countering goals. So what I argue, and I'm coming back now to 16+1 and the Belt and Road, what I argue, this is really a great tool for Chinese government, how to balance between the two. For international countries, Belt and Road and 16+1 brings promise of cooperating China, of economic opportunities, and so on. For domestic population, Belt and Road and 16+1 show China as a leader of the world, provider of the public goods, as basically a superpower in making. So I think this is at least this is how I understand these two initiatives, and I will conclude with this one to remind the main points. So I think 16+1 and Belt and Road are the examples of politics by economic means. By politics, I mean that China simply wants stable working relations with the 16 countries over here. Economically speaking, they are not so crucial for China. Politically speaking, they are important both in the UN, both in the EU. Interestingly, China has achieved their goals in 16 countries, as I showed you, not by economic means, but simply by the promise of economic means, which is very interesting. Many of us think that China is so much present here, but actually data do not necessarily support that so far. Chinese domestic politics is the key for, when we want to understand foreign policy. And 16+1 and OBOR both basically serve the same or similar purpose of giving Chinese leaders face. When international leaders are coming to China, and basically Chinese people are observing how their